cover sheet with an outline of where we're going, what we're going to cover each week, and then the first discussion question page, which deals with a little background information, and then the first two verses of 1 Timothy chapter 1 about Paul and Timothy and him being an apostle, and some questions on that. And then we'll be off and running into our textual study of that. Remember that we have a new subject study, topical study on Wednesday nights about the virgin birth, and we'll be in that for a while because we have a lot to cover about the virgin conception of Jesus, what all that entails and every implication of it and all the characters that are associated with it. We've got a big study, and both of those were by recommendation, and I think they're great recommendations. Really, really good studies coming up. And we've got, again, one more week in this, and then Wednesday night will be probably our last Wednesday night in Proverbs. We're just doing some concluding thoughts, and then we'll be off into our new study about the virgin conception. Okay, so last week we covered the first question, which there was a lot involved in that about Pharaoh and the hardening of his heart and the people of Israel being backed in a corner. We talked about all that last week. It gets us to question number 2 in Exodus chapter 14. And the question is this. Number 2, how did the people react to the news that Egypt was after them? And this comes in verses 9 through 18. Were their accusations justified, or should they have had a different response than they did? What does it seem that they have forgotten, and is there a lesson here for us? Now, before we open it up for some discussion, let's read these verses, and then I'll open it up and you tell me what you think about this. Let's start in verse 9. So the Egyptians pursued them, all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh, his horsemen and his army, and overtook them camping by the sea of Pi-hahiroth, before Baal-zephon. And when Pharaoh drew near, the children of Israel lifted their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them. So they were very afraid, and the children of Israel cried out to the Lord. Then they said to Moses, because there were no graves in Egypt, have you taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you so dealt with us to bring us up out of Egypt? Is this not the word that we told you in Egypt, saying, let us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to have served the Egyptians than that we should die in the wilderness. And Moses said to the people, do not be afraid, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which He will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall see again no more forever. The Lord will fight for you, and you shall hold your peace. And the Lord said to Moses, why do you cry to me? Tell the children of Israel to go forward, but lift up your rod, stretch out your hand over the sea, and divide it, and the children of Israel shall go on dry ground through the midst of the sea. And I indeed will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, and they shall follow them. So I will gain honor over Pharaoh and over all his army, his chariots and his horsemen. Then the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I have gained honor for myself over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. What do you think about their response? What do you think here? It does sound that way. It does sound like maybe, just maybe, that they were very comfortable in being slaves in Egypt, because that's what they were, but it sounds as though they, at least in this situation, had a preference for that.
It's hard for me to wrap my mind around that. If memory serves me correctly, the average life expectancy for adult males is in his mid-30s, so they literally work to death.
They work to death.
So how would you want to stay?
Yeah.
I'd rather die out in the wilderness.
Yeah. But why do you think they say that, given that? Because Barry's making a great point about, as a slave, your life expectancy is very low. And we read chapter 1, chapter 5 and 6, where the taskmasters are, they're beating them with rods. So why would they now say, it'd be better for us to stay in Egypt? It just seems very odd that they would say that, given what they've come out of. Marilyn? Yeah. You do forget a lot of stuff. And you think that's what they're focused on right now? Because as they look back, what's probably foremost on their mind right now? They're going to slaughter us. They're going to slaughter our children. They're going to wipe us off the face of the earth. And maybe it's from the standpoint of extinction that they're thinking about. Yeah, there's a lot of unknown here.
Yeah.
And they could look back and see that they had a place to sleep, they did some work hard, they had food to eat, and now they're out here faced with you're boxed in by the sea and
Yep.
fixing to be killed. So the known was better than the unknown.
Yeah. Jen, I saw your hand too. Fear of the unknown. Yeah, it's not quite as strong as it needs to be, because I mean they literally just saw God do 10 amazing. He upheaved Egypt is what he did, and they have so soon forgotten that. And sometimes physical circumstances can make us forget things. Tom? Yeah. Well, it's not the only time that God will make a statement like this. You know, it's a statement given what He says after that and what He does after that. It isn't kind of like what Jenna was saying. It's a statement a lot like, do you not have enough faith? Have I not proven myself to you that I'm capable of handling these situations? And in this conversation, did you notice, and we'll get to this in just a second, but just initially, did you notice in verse 12, what did they say? We're given a little insight into some history here. What did they say to Moses? We told you to leave us alone when we're in Egypt. We told you. We begged you to just leave us alone. So there's a little bit of history here, and they seem to be pulling out some history and saying, you know, we did tell you that we'd rather stay here than go with you, and we told you that from the very beginning. So let's take a look at it. Look at verses 9 and 10 again. These verses give us a real sense of the terrain. And we've made allusion to this before about that they really were literally boxed in. And they were in a position where there was really literally nowhere for them to go except across the sea. By God's choosing, He did that. He's about to show them something. But it says they were camping beside the sea at Pi-hahiroth and Baal-zephon. And they lifted up their eyes because they're behind them, so they are boxed in. We know that terrain had deep walls of rock, right? It was very cavernous. You know, they were in deep ravines leading to the sea. And because their visibility was limited, and it wasn't until the Egyptians closed the distance and were literally right behind them and blocked their exit that they knew that they're either God was, well, I'm not so sure at this point that that's what they're seeing. They're just seeing termination at this point. And the Bible says in verse 10 that they weren't just afraid. How does the Bible describe it? They were very afraid. I mean, there's a lot of superlative there. They were very afraid. And because this is the interesting thing. If you think about the number of the people who left Egypt. Remember, we said that you've got an initial number of 600,000 men besides the women and children, right? So you're talking about potentially a crowd of 2.5, 3 million people. That's the estimate of the crowd that leaves Egypt. There's only maybe a couple of 10,000 men, tens of thousands of people after them. So the Egyptian army is greatly outnumbered. They're greatly outnumbered by the sheer volume of the people. But the Egyptians are also well trained, and the people of Israel are not. They are armed, the Egyptians, and the people of Israel are not. And they assess the situation physically, but not through the lens of faith. And you remember the statement in 2 Corinthians 5:7? We're supposed to walk by faith, not by what? Not by sight. And the way we look at things physically doesn't often represent the spiritual reality of a situation, and they were looking through sight and not really by faith. And the Bible does say in verse 10 that they cried out to the Lord. So they do make a petition to God, but it's also a complaint because that complaint goes through Moses in the next verse. But there's something good to be said about this, though, because in time of trouble, who should we look to? God. We should look to God in time of trouble. I love Psalm 46. I think that's a psalm probably about Hezekiah and the people in Jerusalem who are pretty much surrounded by the Assyrians, that because there seems to be a great description of that very event. And he says, God is our refuge, a very present help in trouble, and He is that. So it's a good thing to cry to the Lord when we are in trouble, but we must be ever careful that when we appeal to God in time of trouble, that we're not accusing Him of some malcontent, and that seems to be what they're doing here. And plenty have over history, and they've been put in their place for doing that, for accusing God of a wrong motive. But remember, if God is in the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night, and as these events unfold, by the way, we seem to get a sense this is all happening at nighttime. Drop down to verse 20 and 21, just thinking out loud. 20 and 21, we'll get to this in a second. It said, there's God. He came between the camp of the Egyptians, the camp of Israel. There was a cloud of darkness to one. It was a light to the other, so that the one did not come near the other. And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord caused to go back by strong east wind all that night. So you get a sense that these things are happening at night. So you can imagine the terror of looking back and seeing tens of thousands of chariots, maybe with torches, and the sheer sight of that. But they're obviously very, 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 very scared. Then in verse 11, they make their complaint to Moses, and they say, because there were no graves in Egypt, have you taken us away to die in the wilderness? Their cry to God is through the servant Moses. And it is often the case in the Bible that the messengers of God represent God. So as complaint would be made against a messenger of God or through the messenger of God, it would be ultimately made to God. Do you remember the example in Acts chapter 9? Saul of Tarsus is on the way to Damascus to deliver letters so that Christians can be brought up on charges and ultimately killed. And when Jesus confronts him, he says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Well, who had he been persecuting? Christians, right? So what you do to the people of God, you do to God. And the complaint here is really to Moses, but it's ultimately to God because Moses is the representative of God. And there's a good example of that. But they're obviously, and I think Don's right, that what they've done at this point is they've looked behind them, they've looked in front of them, they see there's nowhere to go, and they're convinced they're going to die. That's what they're convinced of at this point. So in verse 12, they remind Moses that they had initially been hesitant to leave the land of Egypt, which is one of those things, I don't understand it, right? They were slaves. Their service was not kind. The position they were in was not a good position, and yet they had initially been hesitant to do that. So hold your place. Go back to chapter 5. Look at Exodus 5. Here's something we covered some weeks ago. Look at chapter 5. So look at verse 21. This is when Moses and God have communicated, and God's commissioned Moses to go and lead the people out, and Moses is going back to talk to the people. Look at verse 21, very last, about in the last 3 verses here. They said to them, this is Moses and Aaron, they said to them, let the Lord look on you and judge, because you've made us abhorrent in the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, to put a sword in their hand to kill us. And so when they first hear God's plan to lead them out of the land of Egypt, what's their reaction to it initially? You've turned the Egyptians against us. This is not good. You go commune with God, but you leave us alone. That's what they're saying. Then go to chapter 6. This is after Moses has made his first appearance to Pharaoh and said, let the people go. They've got to go serve God. In chapter 6, drop down and look at verse 9. So Moses spoke thus to the children of Israel, but they did not heed Moses because of anguish of spirit and cruel bondage. Now, maybe they have in mind a particular conversation over in chapter 14 that they're referencing, but these are at least some of the bedrocks of that conversation, because they had initially been very resistant to Moses and the plan to leave Egypt, which is crazy. But at some point, they'd expressed what they say here, that they wanted to be left alone and continue as slaves in Egypt. And as I was thinking of this, I think there is it always happens after the fact. This is always an after-the-fact complaint. And this is a very similar situation. Sometimes people are confronted with the gospel, and they obey the gospel, and then after a while they find themselves in sin, and then when you express concern and say, hey, this is this is not a good choice. This is not a good life. You need to come back to the Lord. I've heard people say before, well, you should have just left me alone. Why'd you even try to convert me? And they go back to, it's the same complaint that Egypt was making. Why didn't you just leave me in bondage? And so they complain, and they blame the evangelist, and so that happens. And I think you have a picture of that, just a little bit of it, in Matthew 13 in the parable of the sower, when he goes out and some of that soil is very hard packed, and even that's not quite so hard packed receives soil, but it only lasts for a little bit because it goes right back to where it was. And I think you see that principle even spiritually true today. But they obviously were very afraid. And then because they were very afraid, verse 10, when God responds, what's the first thing he tells the people? Verse 13. They were very afraid, and God said what? Don't be afraid. Don't do this. Don't have that reaction to the situation. And Moses was confident. Moses obviously was very confident that God would deliver them. He wanted them to believe the same thing that he did. And he tells them a couple of things. And I love this. There's deep language here that tells us something about the people. So he says, don't be afraid. And then the first thing he tells them is what? Stand still. What do you think that means? Yep, calm down. The word stand still literally means here to take a stand or to plant your feet. If there was the fear, if they looked back and saw, and boy, what a sight at night to have seen that. You look back and you see just torches on chariots and tens of thousands of them rolling towards you. What's the initial reaction? There's chaos. All right, but the same thing, like a modern day example of that would be, God forbid it would ever happen anywhere, but if you hear a gunshot go off, instead of assessing the situation and trying to calmly deal with the situation, what's the thing everybody does? You just scatter. And you probably have millions of people who are just at the same time, what are we going to do and where are we going to go? And they're just scattering everywhere. And Moses said, be still, stand still, because he wants their attention. So it implies that there was a lot of scurrying about. Moses tells them to stop moving and be still. And then what does he tell them secondarily? And he uses a particular word. What's the sense he uses here? See the salvation of the Lord. Have they heard something like that before? Back at the very beginning, when God and Pharaoh were locking horns, Pharaoh kept saying, well, by whose authority? And Moses would say, by God's. And then he would say, well, I'm Pharaoh and I can do what I want. And God said, see what I will do in Egypt. And they've seen demonstrations of that. And when Moses said, see the salvation of the Lord, what should have immediately been triggered in their mind? The memory of what God did in Egypt. If God can do all those things, He's certainly got us on this occasion. And you see that back in Exodus chapter 6 and verse 1. He's talking about visible demonstration of the power of God. That's what's under consideration right now. And verse 14, he reminds them that God was going to fight for them and that victory would completely remove the threat of Egypt. And we hinted toward this last week, all right, because Pharaoh's out there with them, that Pharaoh's involved in this. And God's going to say in verse 18, I'm going to gain honor not just over Pharaoh's chariots and over the horsemen, but over Pharaoh too. Pharaoh's gone after this. Joel? Yep. Oh, sure. I don't doubt that at all. Yeah, I think that's safe to conclude that God had already discussed His plans with Moses on this. Art? Yeah, as it goes on, we find out that it'll talk about that Moses would call for the elders of the people. And it sounds like there were representatives of these groups within this massive number of people, and that Moses would communicate with them, and that communication would go out to them. But you're right, it would have been much different than having a microphone and being able to address that many people at once. It's been much different than that. Look at verse 15. He says, why do you cry to me, tell the children of Israel to go forward? Now this to me is super interesting. This is a word picture, okay? They are literally trapped. What is behind them? The armies of Egypt, right? The whole army of Egypt has emptied toward them. The only thing laying in front of them is the sea. And what does he tell them? Go forward. Well, what in the world does that mean? Okay. There might have been a little bit of distance between them. Maybe they were off in the ravines and you had a little bit of maybe a beach area to get to the sea. And what he's telling them is, you go up right to the edge of the sea. I mean, he's telling them that's the direction they're going to go. And they're walking literally to the edge of the water at this point. I can see that happening. They're just basically assembling right at the mouth of the sea. So they go directly to the edge of the sea, which would require a great deal of faith on their part to trust in God, which means here their ability to look beyond the physical obstacle. They would have to come to the conclusion God is going to do something. If He says there's salvation and we're right at the water, I mean, here's the lip of the water right here, something's about to happen because He's just told us to watch what's about to happen. So God outlines the plan. It's basically a 5-step plan. The first thing that would happen is that Moses would hold his staff, his rod, over the sea, which would be over the edge of the sea. The sea will then divide. Israel will walk through on dry land. Verse 17, God tells them Egypt is going to be destroyed and God will be glorified. That's the 5th thing. God will be glorified as a result of that. Now, nothing really difficult to understand, but it is a reminder that every act of God in history is meant to draw attention to who? Back to God. Everything God has ever done in history is meant to turn our attention back to Him so that God is glorified. And He even says it right here, verse 18, when all this has happened, I will have gained my honor for myself over Pharaoh, his chariots, and over his horsemen. This is a lot like, to me, the passage in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 31. Whatever it is that we involve ourselves in life, whatever it is, it should be aimed at giving God glory, because everything should be aimed at giving God glory back. And then there's that passage in Revelation 4 when John is in the throne room and he sees all of the beasts and the elders and that great crowd around the throne, and they're saying, you are worthy to be praised, O Lord. So this is very indicative of that, because whatever God does, it's intended to give glory back to God. Now, question number 3. What's the initial thing that God does to delay the Egyptian army? He's giving the people time, but what's the initial thing that He does in verses 19 and 20, and what should the people have learned from that? What's He do initially? The cloud moves into a different place, but for concealment purposes. Look at verse 19. The angel of God who went before the camp moved and went behind them, because he had been before them up until this point, and the pillar of cloud went before them and stood behind them. What's the effect of that? Verse 20, it came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel. Thus it was a cloud of darkness to one, and it gave light by night to the other, so that the one did not come near the other all that night. So there is some strategy, right, on the part of God to help the children of Israel make their trip across. So He mentions here, first of all, the angel of God, and He's been telling us since the beginning, back in chapter 13, verse 21, that the Lord is doing this. So we presume that this is language that just represents God in some way. Verse 14 of chapter 14, God said, I will fight for you. Verse 17, I will gain honor for myself. So this is probably just, like in Genesis, like the angel of the Lord, it's probably just some language that's used to represent the action of God Himself. But He moved and went behind them so that it came between the army of Egypt and the Israelites. Now, it's already nighttime, because in verse 20 it says, it gave light by night to the other, so that the one did not come near to all that night. So we know it's nighttime, it's dark, but there's something about the way the cloud projected backward that it increased the darkness that was behind them. And there are some commentators who say it was likely a fog. I don't know if that was the case or not, but I know that on the other side it was like a flashlight. It was pointing the way that they would go across the Red Sea. And here's what that should have meant for them. It should have reminded them, just in that action alone, because they would visibly watch this cloud move behind them, and all of a sudden Israel is confused. They don't know what to do because of the confusion that would be caused by the extra additional darkness. It should have reminded them, one, that God always has situations under His control because He's sovereign. Nothing is too difficult for God. God can even slow an army down if He wants to slow an army down. It is also proof that no plan of God would ever fail. It will ever fail. In fact, do this. Look at Romans 8. This is all these little lessons in Scripture that come to us in stories are great reminders of this truth. Look at Romans chapter 8. Romans chapter 8. Romans chapter 8. Listen to verse 28. And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose. Now, how do we, and I don't say us particularly, but I just mean in general, when people read that verse, how do they usually apply that verse? Good things will only ever happen in my life because God loves me, and good things always work out for those that love God. Is that exactly what he's saying, though? What's he talking about here? Listen to the end of it when he says, to those who are called according to His purpose. And then it says, for whom He foreknew, He also predestined to be conformed to the image of His Son, that He might be the firstborn among many brethren. Moreover, whom He predestined, those He called, He justified, those He justified, those He also glorified. That's talking about the eternal plan of God. So here's our application. Were there times in the history of God's people, like now, they're up against this body of water, there's nowhere to go, the Egyptian army is right behind them. Does this prove to us that no matter in the darkest of times in the history of men, when it seems like the plan of God is about to be unraveled, did God always make a way for His plan to work? He always made a way for that. And when men couldn't understand it, God always found a way to get them out of that because, I mean, think about it. You've got the entire nation of Israel is out there now facing slaughter from behind, and there's a body of water in front of them, and among them are descendants of Judah through who's eventually coming. You think He's going to let that plan fail? He's not going to let that fail. The Christ is coming out of that group of people. It's not going to fail. There's always going to be a way that He makes that work. So no plan of God will ever fail. And then the third thing that seems to be apparent here is God always has our back. God always has our back so that we can focus on moving forward. God wants us to move forward. God's got behind us. We don't have to worry about that. And I always think it's interesting. I've heard the complaint in some commentators literally say, when they're reading Ephesians 6, verses 10 through 18, when it's talking about the armor of God, you've got the sword of the Spirit, the shield of faith, and the breastplate of righteousness, and the girdle of truth, and feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace. And they'll say, while no armor is provided for the back, it will then explain this. Well, there's a reason why. Who's got your back? You don't need armor in the back. You face forward. You just keep going forward. God's got your back. And I just think that's a good lesson here. That's why He can tell them, don't be afraid. I've got what's behind you. Don't worry about it. Any thoughts on that? All right. Yep, go ahead. Oh, yeah. And it wasn't impossible for them to get through it because they eventually get through it. But whatever He did in the darkness slowed them down to such a degree that the Israelites were able, every one of them, to get across before they finally figured out how to get through that, the Egyptians. And that's what we're about to read about in Exodus chapter 14. So go back. Here's question number 4 now. This deals with the actual physical parting of the sea. So number 4, the parting of the Red Sea is one of the most memorable and amazing miracles recorded in Scripture. This is in verses 21 to 31. So we're going to ask the question, what happens? And let's just walk through it. Verse 21. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. That's what God asked him to do. And the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night and made the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. So tell me your thoughts about this strong east wind. Did he have to do that? Did he have to use a wind in order to accomplish his will? He wouldn't have had to do that. I mean, he created everything out of nothing. So why would he use the east wind? What's the point of this? Gene, what do you think? Mm-hmm. Sure. And there are some physical effects that come from this. Let me ask you this question as a way of thinking about this, also maybe a different angle on this. When the wind blows outside, what's your first reaction? Do you look at it when the trees are moving and the wind is going? You're drawn to it, to the sound of it and to the sight of it. God doesn't have to use any means to accomplish His will. He could have just expressed His will, dry land, waters divided, and poof, it would have been done instantaneously if He'd wanted that. But what happens when the strong wind from the east begins to blow? What happens to the people? They start doing what? They're watching Him divide the seas. And God often used physical things to draw attention to a miracle. When Jesus spit in the ground and made mud and put it in a man's eyes, did He have to do that? But everybody was watching what happened when He did that. And sometimes the physical went along with the miraculous to draw attention to the miracle. Gloria, I saw your hand. That's it. That's it. So they were literally attuned to what was going on because there were some things that drew their attention to the miracle. And you have examples of that throughout the Bible. And then like Gene said, there were obviously, he accomplished that through some divine economy as well through that, through the wind. Then in verse 22, to me, this is what this miracle is all about from a visual standpoint. Verse 22, so the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea, right into the middle of it, on the dry ground, and the waters were a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. There's no other comment that has to be made other than, can you imagine walking through walls of water just extremely high because of the depth of the sea, and you're just literally walking through water that is being restrained, just a wall of it. Amazing. Any comments on that? I just think visually, that's the most visual aspect of this entire miracle. What it must have been like to just walk through, and the sea has opened, and God's holding back the sea. Yeah, Ms. Doris? Yeah, I mean, just something, because, Gene? Amazing. 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 And there's also another purpose for it. One great military tactic is you don't just attack from behind, but what else do? You flank. And by putting them in walls of water, what did He prevent? An attack from the sides. This is brilliant. I mean, obviously it's the wisdom of God. Don? Forget. They've already forgotten. Yep. Yep. And so, great comments. And so what happens next, verse 23 and following, Egypt just follows right behind. The Egyptians pursued. They went after them into the midst of the sea. All Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. Don't you wonder what they were thinking when they went into the sea? What is happening? I mean, they had to be scary for them to go in, because even though Pharaoh was incensed and driving them into it, there probably were some people who had clear enough thought to be thinking, we are walking into a death trap here. Because we've seen what their God can do. We saw him do it down in Egypt, but now they're doing this going through the sea. And then they obviously pushed through the darkness. In verse 24, it came to pass in the morning watch. Somehow they pushed through that. But the Bible says God troubled them, and what he did specifically in verse 25, the trouble is defined in verse 25. He took off their chariot wheels. Now, how he did that, I don't know. There's a lot of conjecture. People say there were thunderbolts and lightning bolts, and God tore them in pieces, and hailstones. We don't really know. But I know this, that for a while, they were just pulling the belly of the chariot through, because the horses were just drawing it without wheels, because the wheels came off, even though we'll never know exactly how he did that. But they were so incensed that they had just driven them in that, but they were stuck. They were stuck. There was nowhere for them to go once they had done that. Tom? Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And it only gets higher, when you take the volume of water that would be taken out from the path of the Israelites is now displaced and put on top of the other. I mean, it's like walking through mountains of water. Visually. Obviously, the Egyptians quickly realized, and they remembered, and God still favored the Israelites, and so they attempted to flee. You see that down in verses 26 and 27. But verses 26 and 27 said God instructs Moses to again hold up a staff, with the very opposite effect, which means the water is going to close up, and it did. And in verse 27, the water returned to normal. But with the force of which the water would return to normal, it returned to full depth, like Tom said. Mountainously high walls of water are now closing back up. And in verse 28, the Bible tells us that all of the Egyptian army is destroyed. Not even one escaped, not even a single one. Not so much as one of them remained. Verse 28, and according to verse 30, Israel was saved. And that goes back to verse 13. The effect of that, verse 31, is that Israel saw the great work which the Lord had done. So the people feared the Lord and believed in his servant Moses, which means that when a miracle was worked like this, fear or respect was the immediate reaction, and then belief came as a result of that, and they trusted in the Lord. So that leaves us now, the last question or two in the notes, and we're going to get to that next week. We're going to look at the Song of Moses and the people. It's beautiful what they sing about God, and some of the lessons we learn, and then also the Song of Miriam and what they do at the end of the chapter, and then a tragedy at the end when just after having walked through mountainously high walls of water, they just forget what God had done and go right back to where they were. And it seems to kind of set the tone and pace for the rest of their history, but it'll be the end of our class next week. But I do appreciate your comments today. Thank you so much. Good comments. Great class.